Yeah, I'm Laura Dale, and I am UK editor at Destructoid.com, as well as freelancing for a lot of other games websites. Hooray, hello, I'm doing a talk. So I'm Laura. I'm probably best known. I'm UK editor at Destructoid.com. I do some work with Jim Sterling. I freelance for a lot of big name game websites. I do freelance stuff for, say, Kotaku, Polygon, Rock Paper Shotgun, etc. And yeah, today I'm going to be talking about breaking into a career critiquing video games. So I have been full-time writing about video games now for about 6 months, and that is all I do for my job now. I'm making my money out of doing that. I've been writing about games for about 3 years, so it took a bit of a while to get into making it into a viable career financially. So yeah, so you want to be paid to talk about video games. It's hard work in a very overcrowded competitive field. I will get that out of the way before we start talking about how to get that job, because it's very important to know there are an awful lot of people in this day and age who want to be paid to write about video games. It is something that so many people look at it and think, oh, this is a dream job, I'd love to do it, I get paid to play video games all day. And because of that, there's a lot of people who are willing to do it for little or no money. And that makes it a very, very difficult career field to try and get into as a paid profession, because obviously not only do you have to be good enough to get paid, but you have to be good enough that you're that much better than the unpaid people that, yeah, it's a real step you have to get over. So it's a very overcrowded field, it's a lot of hard work, it's very difficult to get yourself to stand out. Money is hard won, it comes in small chunks, it's irregular, it can be unreliable. It is not a field that you're going to get into if you want to be making any kind of reliable income. It's a career that you get into for a love of writing, and it's something that you should be getting into knowing that sometimes money is going to be tough because it's hard to get money writing about video games. The big one that a lot of people don't seem to know, which I'll just get out of the way as well before we start, is you spend very little of your time playing video games when you write about video games for a living. The vast majority of your time is play just enough of a game that you know about it and can talk about it if asked, then put it away and spend the whole day writing words, some of which will be boring news articles, some of them will be reviews, and you'll get to play games. But like, I know in my day-to-day I spend very little of my time actually playing video games. So again, I'll get that out of the way. But that said, it's a pretty great job, and we're going to talk about how you can get paid to write about video games. So possibly slightly counterintuitively, the first slide in my let's get paid to write about video games is about starting unpaid. It is not a necessity. It is not something that in theory you have to do. You don't have to start by not being paid to do your work. That being said, as I touched on like a little bit earlier, video games as a writing career is an incredibly competitive field. There are a lot of people in the enthusiast press who are happy to do this for free. And as such, getting noticed and getting your work to a point where people are happy to pay for it, in theory, doesn't require you to do unpaid work, but in practice, a lot of people go that route. It is a good way to build up a portfolio, to get experience, to get work out there, to build up a network of people seeing your work and talking about it. So the important thing is, if you're going to start unpaid, is making sure that while you're not being paid, making sure that you know you are getting something out of the work you're doing. So what are you getting out of this work if you're not being paid for it? I'll talk a little bit about my first experience writing for a game site unpaid, which was a website called MCM Buzz. Now, while this website wasn't paying me, they were able to provide me several things that did come as like a form of payment. The website is connected to the UK's biggest games convention, the MCM London Comic Con, which meant that I had suddenly got access to a huge list of PR companies, mailing lists. I had a good name behind me when I was going for interviews and trying to get review coverage, and it was a really strong name to have behind myself as someone who was a writer with no formal experience. On top of that, they were able to give me an email address with their domain, so I could email people from something a bit more professional than a Gmail address. And I had editors there who were willing to put in an awful lot of time to work on my work and to sort of go through, show me what I was doing wrong, and to put a lot of time and effort into editing my work. So while I wasn't getting paid for the work I did there, by putting in a lot of time and effort there, it did give me a lot of very valuable things that helped me to go ahead in my career. So you'll hear a lot of people who say don't ever undervalue your work by working for free. I think the important thing about working for free when you start out is if you're not being paid, make sure that you still feel you're getting some value out of your unpaid work. It might not be money, but it might be things that can help you further in your career. And the last thing about starting unpaid is knowing when the time is right to move on. So it's all well and good writing for exposure or writing for experience or writing from help for an editor, but you need to know when the time is right to move on from those. So for me, it was, while I was doing all this unpaid work, I started having moments where I would see people sharing my work and I'd get told by my editors things like, oh, well, your article is the best read thing we've had on the site this month, or I would get signals that my work was doing better than other things on that site, and starting to realize, okay, I'm now drawing enough of my own audience that my work is doing better on its own merits than it is on the merits of the site it's on. And that's the sort of thing you need to be aware of. You need to start looking at, okay, what's the right time to move on from whatever unpaid place you're working and to move on to whatever's next. So yeah, starting unpaid, it is not necessarily something you have to do. In practice, it's something a lot of people do decide to do, and it's just about make sure that if you're doing it, that you're getting something out of it that is furthering your career. Next up is establishing a niche, is what I'm going to talk about. So if you can establish a niche as a writer, it is much easier to get yourself noticed. A lot of people are tempted when they start writing about games to try and be a jack of all trades, to know a little bit about everything and to try and make their career that way. And while you can do that, in my experience, what has worked really well for people is having something that you are the most knowledgeable at and focusing on that so that you can get really good opportunities out of that specific niche. And then once you've got that niche established and built up an audience, then you can start broadening out into some of the more jack of all trades areas. For me, this was indiehaven.com. I launched this website with a couple of other writers who were all looking to sort of further their writing careers. And it was an unpaid site. We all just sort of ran it by ourselves. But we found a niche that we had, which for us was indie game coverage that focused on more in-depth looks at the games than other comparable indie sites were doing. And we put a lot of work into it. We used it as a way to sort of establish ourselves as people who knew about this specific niche. And I think within 6 months, we were being asked by like BBC Radio 5 Live, were getting us on to talk about indie news when it happened. We were becoming like a decently known name in the indie circle just because we found a small niche that wasn't being catered to. We catered to it, and that really helped us. The other things that are really beneficial if you're trying to find a niche and focusing on that niche is that if you're the one creating a site to talk about whatever your niche area of coverage is, you can use that as a way to get a lot of other experience for your work. For me, starting indiehaven.com, as well as helping to establish myself as having a niche in the indie game space, it gave me a lot of experience in other aspects of writing that were really valuable to me going forward. Because I was the person who'd started the site, I had the ability to give myself the position of an editor and to start giving myself the responsibilities that editors do down the line. So I was running weekly site meetings and running podcasts and managing other writers and all sorts of things that are very hard experience to get from an actual outlet, but look very good when you go down the line and can say to a website 6 months from now, like, okay, well, for the last 6 months, I've been editor at this site. Look at how it's been doing. These are the jobs I've been doing for the site. So if you have a niche that you're focusing on and you start your own place to talk about that niche, you can use that as an opportunity to give yourself a lot of very valuable experience as a writer. So this is the first bit where we're talking about actual money in my talk about being paid to write about games. So breaking into paid freelance work. Freelance work is what most people who start getting into being paid to write about games will do, which is you don't work specifically for whichever site you're writing for, but you will say, hey, here is a single article I want to write for you. Can we agree on a price? I'll write this article, then I stop being connected to your site. You're not an employee, you are just someone who writes for them as and when they want your work. You can sometimes get paid pretty well for your articles, but it's not consistently paid work. It's reliant on you coming up with ideas consistently that their site can't be writing themselves, that they're willing to pay you for. So it's a demanding way to try and get into paid work because it does rely on you having a lot of original ideas on a regular basis and being able to reliably sell them to people. There are a couple of avenues of freelance work that people do. So the first one is freelance reviews. Now, if you're getting into freelance reviews for websites, it is likely you will be playing terrible games. It will not be fun. You will be playing the 1, 2, 3 out of 10 terrible, terrible, terrible shovelware games. It won't be fun. You will likely be on a very short word count, so you'll have no real ability to actually stretch your writing muscles. It will be, here's 300 words at most to talk about why this game is not very good, and you won't get paid very much money for it. Generally, it is, we don't have time to review this. We will give you just enough money that we can justify saying we've paid you. Write about this terrible game, then you're done. So getting into reviews that way is difficult. Most people who get into reviews do it once they're already established at a site. Just know if you get into freelance reviews, it will not be paid well. And generally, they pick from pools of already existing freelancers. So you're not likely to contact a site and say, I'd like to do reviews for you and get any answer back. But if you're already doing features for them and you say, I'd like to do reviews, they may have some terrible games for you. Next up is breaking into freelance features. In terms of writing features as a freelancer, there are 2 key questions that you have to ask yourself when you're thinking about what you should be pitching to people, which is, why should it be you writing this feature, and why can't a member of staff on that website write this feature? So I think the best way to talk about this is, lots of people who are initially trying to pitch features to websites will do opinion features. They will say, hi, Polygon or IGN, this thing has happened in the news, this is my opinion on it, I'd like to write about my opinion. Opinions are something I got told by editors very early on are a dime a dozen. Everyone has an opinion. Just by virtue of having an opinion is unlikely to get you freelance work, because any opinion you have, the editor can read that and be like, okay, I'm sure we can find someone in the office who shares that opinion who can write that same article. There is nothing unique about the fact you have an opinion in and of itself. When you're coming to pitching freelance features, the important questions are, what is it about your opinion that specifically only you can write? What is it about you that means you can write this feature? What is it about this feature that means that their staff writers don't know anything, that they don't know enough about it to write the feature themselves? So I'm going to put up an example of a pitch. It's a little bit small on the screen, but it's broken up into a couple of parts. So for this example, this is a feature I wrote last year for Kotaku that I initially pitched them, called My Drug-Riddled RPG Town. The title, that was the subject line, is simple enough. There was a game that was set in my hometown where I grew up that depicted it as being full of drug dealers and prostitutes and other sorts of not very nice stereotypes about my town, and I disagreed with how this game represented my town. Now, what's important about this pitch is that it answered those questions of why me and why not someone on Kotaku's staff. No one on Kotaku's staff lived in that town and had my perspective of the town. No one had grown up there, and I had. I had the personal perspective of, I grew up in this place, this is my perspective on its representation of my town. And I think that's the important thing that comes down to most pitches that I've had successful are the ones that can answer why me and why not anyone that you already have on staff. Looking a little bit more at this pitch while we're on it, I've broken it up into a couple of sections just for how this pitch was put together for anyone that's wondering. The first section was essentially the introductory paragraph as it would have been of my article, which is, here is something that sort of sets the tone, shows you a little bit of my writing style, that says, this is the article I want to do, and this is why it's interesting. From then, the second paragraph is much less about being flowery with the text and being a lot more direct about, this is mechanically the piece I want to write. I want to write about these points, I want to hit these notes, these are the things I want to talk about in the piece. Then, third piece is, I'm pitching the article to be this length and being very sort of, I know roughly how long my work is, this is how long I think it should be, this is how it compares to your website standard length and that sort of thing. I didn't do on this piece something I should have done on this pitch, which I will point out, is where I've put the 1,500 word suggested limit is also where you should be pitching roughly what you think the piece should be worth to the site. If you can say I'm looking for X amount of money to do this pitch, it suggests that you are a professional, that you've been doing this for a while, that you know what you're doing as a freelancer. That is difficult information to get. If you talk to other freelancers, usually people who do freelancing all the time are very willing to share that information with you privately and to sort of discuss what the going rates are at sites. The best way, like if anyone wants to ask me about rates for sites at any point on Twitter, feel free, I can talk to people about it, because like that's the only way to know this information, is to ask someone who already knows. If you can go in knowing what a site pays for their work and say that's how much I'm after in your initial email, it says a lot about your professionalism, and it usually is a very good sign for sites. And then the last bit is talking about what you already do. This is important if you've not freelanced for a site before, is say, this is the kind of writer I am, this is the sort of stuff I do, this is where I've written for, maybe include 2 or 3 links to places, articles you've written before that they can read if they want to see more of your writing style. And that's generally the format of a pitch. So the essentials of a pitch. The first question you should always ask if you're trying to pitch a feature to an outlet is your editor currently taking pictures? Best way to do this is to literally just tweet the editor and say, hello, editor at Polygon, Ben Kachera, or Keza McDonald at Kotaku UK, and send them a tweet. Are you currently taking pictures? If they say yes on Twitter, that's fine. Go ahead and email them. Just make sure that you know that they currently have a budget and they're willing to accept pitches before you put time into writing one. The next point is, can you pitch your interesting article in a sentence, a tweet, or a subject line, or a title? You want to be able to take any article that you want to pitch to an outlet and boil it down to a very, very simple, very short summary of what it is. If your article is good and has a very strong core to it, you should be able to, in a single tweet in 140 characters, say, this is my article and why it's interesting. That is a really important thing to practice, and I think it's something that anyone who wants to freelance should go and practice this now. Is if you have an idea that you think, oh, I'd love to write this for a site, just get that article and try and fit a very good description of it into a single tweet, because the more concise you can get your pitches for articles, the better by far. If it's an opinion, like we talked about before, what is it about it that informs it? What is it about you that means you're the person who can write this? Why can't someone at the site write it? Don't worry if you don't hear back from editors. This is a really important one when you're starting out freelancing. A lot of people get very discouraged early on because they send off pitches and don't hear anything back and think, oh, is it my writing? Is my writing not good? Was my pitch not good enough? What is it? Does the editor not like me? And it's really important from early on to get used to that. Like, I freelance full-time now, and I still have editors that I've worked with before that like my work, that sometimes won't answer my pitches. And it's not because they don't like them. Sometimes it's just because their inbox is full, or they're busy on work trips, or they mean to get back to it later and they don't, or they don't have a budget. Sometimes, like, the best thing you can do is maybe follow it up a couple of weeks later. If you haven't heard back from an editor, like, pitch it again and say, hey, I pitched you this a couple of weeks ago. Don't know if you saw it. I hope you're interested. If they don't reply after that, don't assume that they don't like it. Just move on and pitch them again in the future. It's hard to do because it can be really disheartening when you're starting, when none of the editors get back to you. That will happen for a long time. It's a difficult hurdle to get over, but you just have to try and be as confident as you can in your work and think, it's not anything I've done. Editors are incredibly busy. They have very busy lives. They don't always get back to everyone. Talk prices up front and deliver on time. So talking about prices up front is a really important one. I've just had my first pitch accepted for Polygon, and I was talking to Ben Kachera over there, who's one of their editors, about my pitch. And apparently one of the things that really won him over was that right from the beginning, I suggested a price to him. I was like, this is how much I want for this article. And apparently that's something that very few freelancers do, and that a lot of freelancers are scared to do, that they are scared of talking about the money involved. I pitched the price higher than his budget allowed. We negotiated, but he was like, the fact that you pitched a very sort of a higher price than what we usually pay to us, that worked well to him. What he said about it was that he looked at my high pitching price for the article, and his response was, ooh, this is someone who values their work, thinks they're good at what they do, has obviously been told at some point that their work is good, and values what they do. They're a professional and they're willing to push their work as a professional's work. So the idea of pitching a price, and even if you're unsure on what to pitch, pitching at the higher end or above what you think your work is worth, is good. It gives you room to negotiate and it shows a level of professionalism. Delivering on time is the most important thing you can do with an editor as well, obviously. If you suggest, like, I'm going to do this 1,500 word piece by next Friday and something comes up and you can't write it by the deadline, let your editors know as soon as possible, because most editors are understanding. They will make exceptions if problems come up, but if a deadline goes past and they haven't heard from you and you haven't done it, you will never get work with that editor again, because being reliable to an editor is one of the most important things you can do, and editors are not going to spend any time on someone who has been unreliable and has not kept them in the loop on why something's not come in when it was supposed to. So networking and growing an audience is next. So one of the big things that I see very few people doing when they start writing that I think is really important just from day one, even if you're still doing unpaid work, is sharing your work with editors who you think might like them. A really good example is Keith Stewart at The Guardian has a real interest in writing about video games that centres on autistic protagonists and autistic spectrum disorders. This is something he talks about a lot on Twitter, and he'll sort of mention it, and every editor has like their one thing that editor clearly likes articles on such and such a topic. If you read editors' Twitters, you'll get an idea of the sort of things they do and don't find interesting. Let's say while I was still being unpaid as a writer, I'd written something for my own blog about autism in video games. What my suggestion is tweet that to an editor that you know is interested in it, like in this example, Keith Stewart at The Guardian, and say, hey, look, this is an article I wrote. I think you'd find it interesting. Let me know if you like it. Because in the worst case scenario, this editor's not going to read your work and that's it, and they never look at it again. In the best case scenario, they read your work, they enjoy it, they share it themselves, they maybe even follow you on Twitter to see more of what you write. This is the main way that most of the contacts I have in this industry were made, was finding things that editors were interested in already and that they liked work on, sharing my work with them semi-regularly until they started to share my work and started to follow me, and we started talking that way. That is how I built connections with editors and became someone that they recognized, which meant when it came time for me to start pitching, they already knew who I was, and that was a real foot in the door, because it meant that people would actually stop long enough to read my pitches, which is half the battle. Ask anyone who you want to get involved in something you're working on, just ask them, because you never know who's going to say yes. A lot of how I made connections initially in the industry with editors and developers and people like that was that I would just ask them to be on podcasts or ask them to do interviews. And I think the best way to do this is ask people who you think are out of your league, that you think won't respond to your replies. Ask them to do work with you. Because the worst they can do is say no. And an awful lot of times they will say yes. When I was still an unpaid writer, I had podcasts where I recorded a podcast with Greg Miller from IGN. I've recorded podcasts with so many people who I thought were out of my league at the time just by nicely asking, because a lot of people are really nice and they will say yes if you go out of your way to try and ask them for things. Another big thing in terms of networking and growing an audience is podcasting, video work, and investment in personality. You'll hear a lot of people these days who are talking about the growth of YouTube as an alternative avenue for video game criticism, that it's sort of replacing traditional text critique and that it's the new thing in terms of talking about video games. I don't think it's necessarily going to replace written criticism, video, but I think that the important aspect that video has is that it's a really big tool in terms of putting your personality across to your audience and building, building a network of people who know your personality and want to see more of you as a person rather than just the words you write. This is what video is really good at. It's why a lot of sites like IGN that have their text written editors also do on-camera video work, have a lot of find that their readers have a lot of personal investment in those writers because of their personality coming across. It's also the reason that a lot of websites have podcasts, because if you can get your voice out on a podcast, it's a great way for people to get a sense of your personality and a sense of the kind of person you are. And that's the sort of thing that gets readers to have a long-term engagement with you as a personality. It's this idea that you are a human being that they can listen to and see and have conversations with. And getting those people invested early on is really important. It is the way that you build up a loyal readership outside of the outlets that you're attached to. Then my last couple of points on this slide, I've got reliable work output that's consistent. Once you start building up an audience and there are people who like your work, getting work out on a reliable schedule early on is really, really important. Like, I know for myself, the people who like my work can find, like, my indie games podcast is on a Monday, my general geek culture podcast is on a Tuesday, video game news is on a Wednesday, my podcast with Jim Sterling's on a Thursday. Like, there are certain keystones where they know, oh, I like this kind of content from this writer. They'll have it on this sort of basis. Establishing that early on is really important because it gets people coming back to you. It gets people not just looking at your work when they happen to see it, but knowing that it's something in their routine that they are going to come back to and that they should make time for. The earlier you can get that as something that your readers know that you have, like, a reliable schedule, it really does help you going forward. And then the last one, physical networking events. Physical networking events are more difficult to do for a lot of people in terms of getting to events and also in terms of the confidence required to physically network, because you've got to very quickly become confident with introducing yourself to people who you've never met before, telling them who you are, making yourself memorable, and, like, not being afraid to take some of their time to talk to them. It's a really important thing. Like, there are so many events that go on in the UK at this point. Like, you've got the big conventions, but there's also smaller events. You'll have meetups. There will be, there are so many events that go on. If you know that someone you want to work with in the future is at an event and you see them tweeting they're going to something, not in a creepy way, but if you also go and you introduce yourself and then leave that situation, that is a really good way to get yourself noticed. You just have to have the confidence to do it if you can, is go and talk to new people and make sure they remember who you are. Okay, next up for me is Patreon. For anyone who doesn't know what Patreon is, it is basically a subscription model that a lot of people have started using that mimics the old magazine subscriptions. For me, it is, I will put out this amount of work every month, and people who like my work can pay a subscription fee and get emailed every time I do some work and sort of chip some money in. It's a relatively new system that people have started using in the last year. It's not right for everyone. It requires an established audience because it's relying on people who know your work, know that they like it, and have liked it for long enough that they are willing to opt into putting money into your work. It requires an audience that is already established and that is committed and knows they definitely like your work for it to work. Because obviously people don't want to there's so much free writing out there, so much free content. Why would they spend money on you unless they already know, yes, I like this person's work and they've been doing it for long enough. If you're looking at trying to work out if Patreon's a good model for you, a really good estimate that I've seen used that's held true for me and a lot of other writers who use Patreon is, if you have a Twitter account, look at how many followers you have, divide that by 8, and that is roughly how many dollars per month you can expect to get out of your audience. For me, that's held true. I know it holds true up to, like, Jim Sterling has about the same percentage. A lot of writers have this 1/8 roughly of their Twitter followers will give them $1 a month as an average. So that is a good way of working out, like, how big is my audience, and is my audience large enough that as a writer, I am likely to make the amount of money I want to make out of launching a Patreon. I'd say it's better to launch a Patreon later than sooner. I tried launching a Patreon once in the past, before the current one I have now, when I had about 150 Twitter followers, and I made about $20 a month out of it, and it did not justify the time I was putting into it, and I had to stop it. And the fight that you then have when you try and relaunch and say, oh, I launched a Patreon before and it didn't work, but I'm doing the same thing now, that is a real hurdle to get over. It is much better if you wait until you have an established audience where you know my audience is large enough that it will probably support the amount of money I want to make out of it. Like, the longer you wait, to launch one is better than trying to launch one, closing it, and then having to fight to launch one again. And then the last point on Patreon is just, it works best as a platform for those who've done free work for a length of time already. The way I launched mine was, hey, I've been doing these features for 2.5 years, unpaid. Have you liked the last 2.5 years? Well, I need money to continue doing that level of output. Do you want to put some money in? It works best if you have a lengthy, repeated amount of output that people can rely on and say, oh yeah, they've done this much work for this much time on this schedule. I'm confident that they'll continue doing it if we put some money in. And then the last one is the big holy grail, which is salaried editors' positions. Getting established editorial experience and getting one of these like jobs on a salary is very difficult. Most of the positions that would give you editorial experience require editorial experience to get in. It's one of these things that you see it come up in so many industries. We're looking for an entry-level person in this industry, but you need to already have experience to get this entry-level job. And it's a very difficult thing to do. For me, I talked about Indie Haven earlier, the site I started by myself. I'm now an editor at Destructoid, and the bulk of how I got that salaried position was because I was able to demonstrate, hi, I started my own site for 2.5 years. These are the job roles that I did. These are the things I did for this website. These are the bits of editorial experience that I gave myself. I had no formal experience with any established site, but that was enough to get my foot in the door and to get me an editorial position. So that's the only advice I have for getting your own editorial experience is if you can't get it with a site, start your own site and give yourself the experience that they're looking for. An important thing about if you're aiming for editorial roles is understanding how to demonstrate that editorial experience is different from writing talent. I know a lot of writers who've tried to get into editorial before and have had problems because their applications are generally, here is a list of really good articles I've written for lots of sites. Here's my articles for IGN, for Polygon, for Dharma Sutra, for wherever you've written for. And they focus on all these things they've done without stopping to think, do I have any editorial experience? Like, do I know how to manage a team? Do I know how to set schedules? Do I know how to maybe run a Trello board? How to do staff meetings? It's very important to make sure that you don't overlook that when you're talking to people about, like, trying to apply for editor positions. And then the last point is a bit of a disappointing one for people, I think, which is a big part of getting editorial positions is being in the right place at the right time and just being lucky generally. I know for me, I started at Destructoid about 6 months before they decided they wanted to have more of a UK presence. And as such, I happened to be in the right place at the right time, that I was their UK person who was writing a lot. And that's why I got offered it. And a lot of it is just luck, being like, oh, I have the right attributes that they're looking for at the right time in the right place. There's nothing you can do about that really, other than just not get discouraged if you don't get positions, because sometimes it's very specific things they're looking for out of editorial roles. You might not ever hear the very specific things they're looking for. It's just a case of make sure that you just keep going for it and understand that sometimes you'll just be unlucky and it won't be the right place or the right time. That's, just how it is. So yeah, I've finished my talk. So does anyone have any questions, I guess? Worrying silence. Ooh. I have not. One question.
It's a bit of a sort of catch-22
Yeah.
again, like the experience question, but you said about finding a niche.
Mm.
Obviously, you've found your niche, but what happens if you find a niche that someone's already found? Is there a way to differentiate yourself?
Yeah, for anyone that didn't hear the question, it's if you sort of want to get into a niche that someone else has already done, how do you differentiate yourself? I know for me, like my niche that I went on was indie games. That is, it's a crowded niche. There's already a lot of indie game sites. What I did to differentiate myself was that we took our site and we were very aware of the fact that lots of indie developers are desperate for coverage, and as such will give up a lot more of their time to press than traditional media will. And as such, we were looking at what other competing sites were doing, and they weren't really taking advantage of that. So we did like weekly roundtables with developers. We were doing much more long-form interviews and features. it's basically just looking at, okay, what is there about this particular niche market that's not being taken advantage of right now, and finding a way to focus your site on those aspects. Like, it's not necessarily finding a new niche, something new about the niche, but finding a new way to take what exists about that writing niche and to turn it into like a different kind of writing. So you can, yeah, I guess that's it. Any other questions? Yeah.
What advice have you got on covering events such as this one?
Okay, so the question's advice about covering events like this one. Most events, even if you're looking in the UK up to things like Eurogamer, which is probably the big one, will give press passes to anyone who has their own site set up. It's very easy to get press passes at this point. It is very easy to just set up your own blog, write a few things, and get press access. Once you're at an event, it's sometimes tempting to put a lot of time into playing the games. Obviously, it's what you do if you go to an event anyway, if you weren't going as press, so it's very tempting to just spend that time playing games. I think the best thing you can do is get a look at everything, get a lay of the land and work out what's at the event. Once you have an idea of what's there, what you find interesting, try doing interviews. Interviews are probably the best chance you have of getting something new out of the event, because a lot of sites will already be there talking about the games, doing their coverage, doing the same as everyone else is doing. So interviews are probably your big place that you can get something unique out of the event. But otherwise, it's just make sure that you're thinking about it as a work event rather than as something that you're at normally. You've got to get yourself into a different mindset to when you go to these events for yourself, and ignore the things that you might want to do in favour of the things that are probably better work opportunities. Does that answer it? Any other questions? Seems like that's it for questions. So I'll say that the Norwich Gaming Festival is being done to raise money for Just Giving. So there is a website, justgiving.com/Norwich-gaming-festival, where you can go to donate money to help. Oh, there'll also be a bucket at the door for people who are in the room. So yeah, thank you very much. Yay. For me, it's really interesting getting to see more and more people who traditionally wouldn't have been able to make video games having access to the tools. We're getting a lot more accessible tools, like things like Twine and Game Maker, and like the Unity's becoming more accessible. It's just, we're seeing lots of people who otherwise couldn't tell personal stories through games suddenly having the tools available to them. It's really nice, because then you get to see a lot more. I think the important bit is you get to see lots of minority groups suddenly getting to tell their own stories through that medium, which is something that hasn't happened before this recent couple of years of indie games. The advice is, it's not necessarily that you do unpaid work, but most people find that in practice they have to. Just make sure you're getting something out of doing your unpaid work. It's very hard to get editors to pay attention to you. Make sure they know who you are before you send your first pitch. Get them reading your work if you can. And then otherwise, just perseverance. It's going to take a lot of time, but you can do it. Just keep your pitches short and you'll eventually get there.